The air is thin at 30,000 feet. The sky above Germany is a pale, washed blue, almost empty, almost calm. Inside the cockpit of a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a single pilot steadies his breathing through an oxygen mask. The engine ahead of him, an 18-cylinder radial, vibrates with restrained violence. Every gauge is alive. Oil temperature, manifold pressure, altitude, speed. Below, the continent stretches out in frozen geometry. Rivers like steel wire, fields carved into squares. Somewhere beneath the cloud layers, flak batteries wait, patient and precise. This aircraft was never meant to turn tightly. It was never meant to dance. It was heavy, overbuilt, a blunt instrument in a war that once favored elegance. But today, weight is an advantage. Altitude is protection. Speed is survival. The pilot's hands do not hesitate. He has learned what this machine can do when it is pushed past expectation, when gravity itself becomes a weapon. Far off, dark specks begin to rise toward him. German fighters, and in this moment alone, high above enemy territory. The outcome of the next few minutes will depend not on theory or reputation, but on how well one man understands the limits of his aircraft and how willing he is to break them. The conditions that made this moment inevitable had been forming for years. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had entered a phase of attrition few planners had fully anticipated. The United States Army Air Forces had committed themselves to a doctrine built on daylight precision bombing, an idea rooted in interwar theory and tested only lightly before the war. Heavy bombers, flying in tight formations, were expected to defend themselves with overlapping fields of machine gun fire, while striking Germany's industrial heart in full view of the enemy. Reality proved harsher. B-17, Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators pushed deep into occupied Europe, targeting ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, oil refineries, and rail yards. Each mission carried the weight of strategic necessity and unacceptable loss rates. In 1943 alone, entire bomber groups were shredded over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, and Kassel. Crews did not speak of missions in weeks or months. They counted them in survival statistics. The Luftwaffe, though increasingly strained, still possessed experienced pilots, efficient ground control, and fighters designed for interception. Messerschmitt Bf-29s and Fokker Wolf W-90s climbed quickly, attacked with discipline, and disengaged before escort fighters could intervene. German doctrine emphasized altitude advantage, surprise, and coordinated passes. Tactics refined since Spain and Poland. The weakness in the American system was range. Early escort fighters, P-38, Lightnings, and P-47 Thunderbolts, could not remain with the bombers all the way to the targets and back. Fuel limits forced them to turn for home, just as German fighters began their most aggressive attacks. Bomber crews called it the fighter gap, and the Luftwaffe exploited it mercilessly. Into this environment came the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. At first glance, it appeared ill-suited to the task. It was massive for a single-seat fighter, weighing nearly twice as much as a Bf-29 when fully loaded. Its fuselage was broad, its radial engine enormous. Compared to sleeker German designs, it seemed slow to climb and reluctant to turn. Early combat reports were unforgiving. Pilots complained of sluggish response and poor performance below 20,000 feet. Yet those same reports hinted at something else. At altitude, the Thunderbolt behaved differently. Its turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine retained power where others faded. In a dive, it accelerated with frightening authority. Where German fighters bled energy pulling out of steep descents, the P-47 simply grew faster, compressibility effects pushing pilots toward speeds they barely understood. Losses continued to mount, but so did lessons. USAAF commanders realized that survival would not come from forcing the P-47 to fight like a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt. It would come from embracing what the aircraft actually was: an energy fighter, built to live in the vertical dimension of combat. Some pilots adapted slowly. Others adapted instinctively. Among them were young men who had grown up far from air academies and flight schools. Men whose familiarity with machines, weather, and limits came not from doctrine, but from experience earned on farms and in workshops across the American Midwest. One such pilot, raised on Iowa soil, would soon push the Thunderbolt beyond its intended role, and in doing so, change how the aircraft was feared by the enemy above Germany. The conditions for that transformation were now firmly in place. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt did not emerge from elegance. It was born from urgency, engineering compromise, and American industrial philosophy. Designed by Alexander Kartveli and the Republic Aviation team, the aircraft was shaped around its engine rather than the other way around. The Pratt & Whitney R28502 Double Wasp was one of the most powerful radial engines ever built, and the Thunderbolt was constructed to harness it at altitude. The key was the turbo supercharger. Mounted deep within the fuselage, fed by long ducting from the engine exhaust, the turbo allowed the P-47 to maintain power well above 25,000 feet. In theory, this made it ideal for bomber escort. In practice, it introduced complexity, weight, and a learning curve few pilots fully understood in early operations. Mismanaged throttle settings could cost power. Poor energy discipline could leave a Thunderbolt slow and vulnerable. But when flown correctly, the aircraft was something else entirely. At high altitude, the P-47 could exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. In a dive, it could go much faster, approaching and sometimes exceeding 500 miles per hour. At those speeds, control stiffening and compressibility effects began to appear, phenomena that were still being studied in wind tunnels back home. German fighters, lighter and more agile, often found themselves unable to follow without structural risk or loss of control. American training doctrine did not initially emphasize these advantages. Many USAAF pilots were taught traditional turning engagements, an inheritance from earlier air combat theories. Against the Luftwaffe, this proved costly. German pilots avoided prolonged dogfights, instead relying on slashing attacks and rapid disengagement. Survival demanded a shift. By late 1943, informal knowledge began circulating within fighter groups. Dive away, not turn. Use altitude, like currency. Never give up speed without a reason. The Thunderbolt, once criticized, became respected by those who learned its logic. It was within this environment that a young pilot from Iowa arrived in the European theater. Like many of his generation, he had grown up working with his hands. Farm machinery did not forgive carelessness. Engines spoke through vibration and sound long before gauges confirmed trouble. That background translated naturally into the cockpit of a complex aircraft like the P-47. He paid attention to how it felt at speed, how it responded under load, how quickly it recovered when pushed hard. Assigned to a fighter group tasked with escorting bombers over Germany, he flew the same missions as everyone else. Long climbs, cold cockpits, oxygen masks freezing at the edges, flak bursts blooming below. He watched other pilots die, not because they lacked courage, but because they followed rules that no longer applied. Combat reports accumulated. Enemy tactics were mapped. Loss ratios were studied. And slowly, within certain squadrons, a realization hardened into belief. The Thunderbolt did not need to outturn the Luftwaffe. It needed to outrun it, downward, with gravity on its side. This belief would soon be tested in the most unforgiving classroom of all, a high-altitude interception over enemy territory, where hesitation meant death, and success depended on whether one pilot was willing to trust speed over tradition. The stage was set for that decision. The pilot who would come to embody this shift in thinking did not arrive in Europe carrying the weight of legend. He was not a product of elite aviation culture, nor did he speak in the language of theory. He had grown up in Iowa, in a world governed by seasons, machinery, and consequence. When something broke, it had to be fixed. When weather turned, you adapted or you paid for it. That upbringing shaped how he flew. In the cockpit of the P-47, he trusted feel as much as instrumentation. He noticed how the Thunderbolt settled into high-speed flight, how the controls stiffened gradually rather than suddenly, how the engine's tone changed as air thinned. Where others feared the aircraft's weight, he recognized stability. Where others hesitated to dive steeply, he sensed margin. Combat amplified these instincts. After-action reports and briefings mattered, but survival depended on decisions made in seconds. He learned quickly that hesitation invited disaster. A split-second delay in breaking away could erase the advantage of altitude. Over time, confidence replaced fear. Not reckless confidence, but familiarity earned through repetition. This was not heroism. It was adaptation. And in the skies over Europe, adaptation separated those who completed their tours from those who did not. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe still controlled the terms of many engagements. German fighters climbed aggressively to bomber altitudes, attacked from above or head-on, then disengaged before escorts could respond. Their goal was disruption, not prolonged combat. The Thunderbolt's answer was energy. Instead of meeting German fighters on their terms, certain USAAF pilots began refusing horizontal engagements altogether. When attacked, they dove. When pursuing, they climbed patiently, storing altitude like ammunition. Engagements became brief, violent, and one-sided. In this framework, speed replaced turning radius as the decisive factor. A P-47 entering a dive could choose when to fight and when to leave. German pilots attempting to follow often found their aircraft shaking, controls stiffening, and altitude disappearing faster than expected. These were not accidents. They were the result of pilots learning to fight the airplane they had, not the one they wished for. From the Luftwaffe's perspective, the Thunderbolt was an enigma. Early encounters had reinforced German confidence. The P-47 appeared slow to climb and clumsy at low altitude. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots believed they could dictate the fight, but as American tactics evolved, that confidence eroded. German combat reports began noting Thunderbolts diving away at extreme speeds, breaking contact with ease. Pursuit was discouraged. Structural limits and compressibility concerns made sustained high-speed dives dangerous in lighter German fighters. and respect in air combat often bordered on fear. The convergence of instinct, tactics, and enemy perception was now complete. What remained was the moment when theory would be tested under fire, and a single decision would reveal whether this approach truly worked when everything was at stake. The Thunderbolt's true advantage was hidden from casual observation. It was not speed alone, nor firepower, though its 850 caliber machine guns delivered devastating weight of fire. It was endurance, mechanical and structural. The P-47 was built like industrial equipment. Its wings could absorb punishment that would have crippled lighter fighters. Fuel lines were armored. Control cables were redundant. Pilots returned with entire cylinders shot away, tail sections torn open, yet the aircraft kept flying. This resilience allowed pilots to commit to high-speed dives without fear of structural failure that plagued other designs. The turbo supercharger, though complex, gave the Thunderbolt its defining trait. At altitude, it allowed the aircraft to retain horsepower while enemy fighters began to lose it. When combined with a steep dive, the result was acceleration that felt almost violent. Pilots spoke later of the aircraft surging forward as if pulled by gravity itself. This technological reality made a new kind of combat possible, one based on physics rather than finesse. Doctrinal change rarely begins at the top. In fighter groups across England, innovation spread through observation, debriefs, and quiet consensus among flight leaders. Pilots who survived shared techniques. Those techniques became habits. Squadron commanders began encouraging vertical separation, disciplined dives, and strict avoidance of low-altitude turning fights. Briefings emphasized energy management rather than aggression for its own sake. Success was measured not only in victories claimed, but in aircraft returned and bombers escorted home. The Iowa pilot was not acting alone. He operated within this evolving culture, reinforced by leaders who understood that survival itself was a form of success. When pilots like him demonstrated the effectiveness of speed-based tactics, leadership took notice. What had begun as instinct slowly hardened into doctrine. There was no romance in this style of combat. High-speed passes left little room for ritual or prolonged engagement. Victories were sudden. Losses were silent. For American pilots, this approach carried emotional weight. Diving away felt, at first, like retreat. Many had been raised on ideals of standing one's ground. Yet experience rewrote those instincts. Living to fly again mattered more than appearances. German pilots, facing enemies who could disengage at will, felt the balance shift. The skies grew less predictable. The fight was no longer governed by skill alone, but by momentum and energy they could not always match. In this moral gray space, survival became the only constant. All that remained was the moment when these lessons would be compressed into seconds, when one pilot, one aircraft, and one decision would determine whether theory translated into survival. That moment was approaching. The mission began before dawn, as most did. Engines started in darkness along the wet concrete of an English airfield, exhaust flames briefly illuminating rows of Thunderbolts lined wingtip to wingtip. Briefing rooms had already gone quiet. The target was inside Germany. The weather was marginal but flyable. Losses were expected. Climbing took nearly an hour. At altitude, the cold seeped into everything. Oxygen masks hissed steadily. Frost crept along canopy frames. The Thunderbolts took station above and behind, spaced to watch the high approaches where the Luftwaffe preferred to strike. Radar contact reports filtered through the formation. German fighters were airborne. The Iowa pilots scanned the upper sky, eyes trained above the bombers rather than around them. Experience had taught him that danger rarely came from where you expected. At 30,000 feet, the P-47 felt solid, almost heavy in the thin air, but responsive. The engine held power. The aircraft was in its element. Then the specks appeared. Dark shapes climbed fast, angling toward the bombers. Fokker, Wolfs, WWIIs, using altitude and sun position to mask their approach. The first attacks came quickly. Cannon fire arced through the bomber formation. A B-17 slipped out of position, engines trailing smoke. The Thunderbolts moved to intercept. In the opening seconds, chaos threatened to take hold. Radios crackled with overlapping calls. Aircraft crossed paths at closing speeds that left no room for error. The Iowa pilot rolled his P-47 onto its back, nose dropping, converting altitude into speed. This was not pursuit. It was positioning. One Fubble 190 broke away below him, diving hard to escape. Instinct pulled at him to follow, but discipline intervened. He waited, counted seconds, watched airspeed build. Then he pushed forward. The Thunderbolt tipped into a steep dive, far steeper than doctrine once allowed. The horizon vanished. Wind noise rose sharply. The airspeed needle swept past familiar markings. 400 miles per hour. 450. The controls grew heavier, but remained usable. Below, the German fighter struggled to escape the vertical. The distance closed rapidly. This was the edge, the point where theory either held or collapsed under pressure. Pull too early, and speed would bleed away. Pull too late, and control might be lost entirely. The Iowa pilot fixed his gaze, waited for the moment the aircraft told him it was ready. Behind him, the bomber stream continued forward, unaware that in this narrow slice of sky, the future of an entire fighting method was being decided in seconds, measured by airspeed and nerve. The outcome would hinge on what happened next. At nearly 500 miles per hour, the Thunderbolt no longer felt like a conventional aircraft. The airflow pressed hard against the control surfaces, resisting every input. This was the region pilots spoke of cautiously in briefings, the threshold where compressibility began to assert itself, where mistakes could become irreversible. He worked with it. As the distance closed, he made small, deliberate adjustments, careful not to overstress the airframe or lock the controls entirely. The German fighter below grew larger in the gun sight, its evasive movements increasingly limited by physics rather than skill. The Fu-190 could not dive faster without risking structural failure. Its pilot had already committed to escape. There was no room left to maneuver. At the correct moment, measured not by training manuals, but by experience, the Thunderbolt's nose came up just enough. The 8.5 caliber machine gun spoke in a single, concentrated burst. Tracers converged. The distance collapsed 2 yards. Pieces broke away from the German aircraft, flashing briefly in the sunlight before vanishing below. The Fu-190 rolled sharply, then fell out of control, disappearing into cloud. There was no time to watch it fall. The Thunderbolt surged past, still carrying enormous speed. The Iowa pilot eased back pressure, allowing the aircraft to recover gradually. He resisted the urge to climb immediately, letting speed bleed away only as much as necessary. Above him, The sky cleared again, empty but dangerous. Radio calls confirmed what he already knew. Other Thunderbolts had executed similar dives. German attacks were breaking off earlier than expected. Some enemy pilots refused pursuit altogether, wary of being drawn into dives they could not survive. The bomber formation held together. For the remainder of the mission, Luftwaffe interference remained sporadic and cautious. Attacks came from greater distance, less coordinated, often aborted before reaching effective range. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. When fuel levels forced the escorts to turn back, the Thunderbolts climbed away with minimal losses. The bombers pressed on, their path momentarily clearer because of what had been proven in those few violent seconds. Back in England, debriefings were methodical. Claims were reviewed. Gun camera footage was analyzed. Speeds, altitudes, and timings were discussed with unusual attention. What stood out was not the victory itself, but how it had been achieved. The Thunderbolt had not been used defensively. It had not turned. It had not lingered. It had struck once, at extreme speed, and disengaged intact. This was not a single success. It was confirmation. From that point forward, dive and zoom tactics were no longer considered improvisation. They became expectation. The P-47's reputation changed, not through propaganda, but through consistent results that even the Luftwaffe could not ignore. He simply flew what worked. But in doing so, he helped force an enemy to rethink how it engaged American fighters over Germany. The consequences of that shift would ripple outward, shaping how air combat unfolded in the months that followed. The effects of that engagement were not dramatic in isolation. No single report declared a revolution. Instead, change arrived quietly, measured in patterns rather than proclamations. Mission debriefs from early 1944 began to show a shift. Thunderbolt units reported fewer losses during high-altitude escort phases. German fighter attacks, once aggressive and coordinated, grew more cautious. Luftwaffe pilots increasingly avoided steep pursuits, breaking off earlier when American escorts maintained altitude advantage. These changes were reflected in intelligence summaries compiled by the 8th Air Force. Analysts noted that German fighters were adapting their attack profiles, favoring head-on passes and long-range firing rather than close-in maneuvering. The reason was simple. Once a Thunderbolt entered a dive, it became untouchable. The P-47's role expanded accordingly. Escort doctrine emphasized altitude dominance. Fighters were instructed to remain above bomber formations whenever possible, diving only when a clear advantage existed. Speed discipline replaced turn-fighting instincts. Loss ratios began to improve. Aircraft survivability also played a role. Thunderbolts returned with battle damage that would have destroyed other fighters. Pilots reported engines absorbing flak fragments, wings holding under stress, control systems remaining functional despite heavy hits. These survivals reinforced confidence, encouraging more aggressive use of vertical tactics. For the Iowa pilot, the aftermath was understated. His name appeared in reports. His actions were discussed in briefings. But the war left little room for celebration. The next mission came quickly, and with it, the same risks. On the German side, the change was unmistakable. Luftwaffe pilots faced enemies who could dictate engagement range and exit at will. Training emphasized avoiding prolonged chases. Fuel shortages and aircraft losses compounded the problem. Every failed interception carried consequences that could not easily be replaced. The skies over Germany were becoming less forgiving for everyone. As winter turned to spring, the cumulative effect of these engagements began reshaping air superiority in ways that extended far beyond individual pilots or aircraft types. By mid-1944, the reputation of the P-47 had transformed. What was once a lumbering, ungainly fighter had become a symbol of American air power's resilience and adaptability. Pilots now embraced its strengths: high-altitude performance, structural durability, and the ability to dive past enemy fighters at nearly uncontrollable speeds. Mission planning reflected this new understanding, emphasizing energy management, altitude preservation, and selective engagement. The impact on Luftwaffe tactics was equally tangible. German intelligence reports flagged the P-47's dive and zoom capability as a significant threat. Pilots were warned against committing to steep pursuit without backup. Older aces, who had relied on turning superiority to win dogfights, found themselves unable to adjust fully. The attrition rate for experienced German pilots increased, while replacement pilots lacked the training to counter energy-based tactics effectively. Within the USAAF, squadrons codified these lessons. Training curricula began to incorporate dive and zoom maneuvers, emphasizing the conversion of altitude into speed as a primary survival strategy. Younger pilots were instructed to resist the instinct to engage in horizontal dogfights and instead rely on the Thunderbolt's strengths. By integrating these practices across units, the Air Force enhanced both offensive and defensive capabilities, leading to higher mission survival rates and more effective bomber protection. For the Iowa pilot and his peers, personal innovation became part of collective doctrine. What had started as instinct, honed from farm life and mechanical intuition, became a replicable method for survival and effectiveness. Reports indicate that these tactics contributed to measurable reductions in bomber losses during subsequent raids, particularly at high altitude over central Germany. The legacy extended beyond immediate operational outcomes. The P-47, once underestimated by friend and foe alike, was now respected for its unique combat profile. American fighters had demonstrated that technological limitations could be overcome with tactical innovation and human adaptability. The war in the air was evolving, and the Thunderbolt had proven that speed, discipline, and instinct could change the calculus of aerial warfare. This evolution, forged through repeated engagements and individual initiative, set the stage for reflection on what it meant for pilots, machines, and the broader trajectory of air combat in World War II. In the quiet aftermath of countless missions, the significance of those high-speed dives became clear. The war did not bend to heroism alone. It yielded to understanding of machines, of physics, and of human instinct. The Iowa farm boy had done nothing extraordinary in the mythic sense. He had simply recognized the truth of his aircraft and acted decisively. The P-47, once maligned for its weight and sluggishness, became a testament to adaptation. Where doctrine was rigid, innovation thrived. Where speed and altitude could be measured in numbers, survival was measured in seconds. Lives were preserved, bombers escorted, and enemy tactics forced into retreat, not by overwhelming force, but by mastery of limits and opportunities. This story is not merely about one pilot or one airplane. It is about the intersection of technology, human skill, and circumstance. It illustrates how warfare evolves not only through invention but through the courage to trust knowledge earned in sweat and trial. The lessons of those skies, discipline, observation, and the willingness to push beyond expectation echo far beyond World War II. Above Europe, in those frozen altitudes where air thinned and sunlight glinted off wing surfaces, history was being written one dive at a time. And in that writing, the Iowa pilot left a mark not of glory, but of profound practical insight. That survival, efficiency, and ingenuity could triumph where raw force alone might fail. The skies remembered. And so did history.